He built it. Every rivet, every beam, every magnificent detail. The RMS Titanic was his masterpiece, his crowning achievement, the ship he'd poured his genius into for 3 years. Thomas Andrews walked its corridors with pride, showing passengers the wonders he'd created. "She's practically unsinkable," he told them. And then, at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, his creation struck an iceberg. Within seconds, Thomas Andrews understood something that would break him completely. His ship was going to sink, and everyone aboard, over 2,000 souls, was going to die because of decisions he had made. For the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, he would watch his masterpiece become a tomb. And in the end, he would choose to die with it, standing alone in the first-class smoking room, staring at a painting, waiting for the water to claim him along with the 1,500 people killed by his design. This is the story of Thomas Andrews, the brilliant naval architect who designed the Titanic, the man who walked its decks with pride on its maiden voyage, and the man who spent his final hours drowning in guilt as he watched his creation kill everyone he'd tried to impress. Thomas Andrews was born in 1873 in County Down, Ireland, into a prominent family. From childhood, he was obsessed with ships. While other boys played, Thomas sketched hull designs. At 16, he apprenticed at Harland Wolff shipyard in Belfast, starting at the bottom despite his family's wealth. He worked every position, from the shipyard floor to the drawing office, learning every aspect of shipbuilding. He was brilliant, meticulous, devoted to his craft. By his 30s, he was the managing director and head of the drafting department. He was the best naval architect in the world. When the White Star Line commissioned 3 sister ships to dominate the Atlantic passenger trade, Thomas Andrews was chosen to design them. The Olympic, the Titanic, the Britannic. These would be the largest, most luxurious ships ever built. Andrews poured everything into the Titanic. For 3 years, from 1909 to 1912, he obsessed over every detail. The grand staircase, the Turkish baths, the gymnasium, the Café Parisien. He wanted perfection. But perfection costs money, and the White Star Line wanted profit. Here's where the tragedy began: the design compromises. Andrews wanted more lifeboats, enough for everyone aboard. The company said no. Lifeboats cluttered the deck, ruined the aesthetic, blocked the promenade views that first-class passengers were paying for. Andrews argued he lost. The Titanic would carry only 20 lifeboats, enough for 178 people on a ship designed to carry 547. It met the outdated Board of Trade regulations, but Andrews knew it wasn't enough. He knew. Then there were the watertight compartments. Andrews designed 16 compartments separated by bulkheads that could seal off sections of the ship if it took on water. The ship could stay afloat even if 4 compartments flooded. This was remarkable engineering. But here's the fatal flaw: the bulkheads only went up to E-deck, not all the way to the top. If water filled one compartment above a certain level, it would overflow into the next, then the next, like ice cubes in a tray. Andrews knew this was a weakness, but extending the bulkheads would have cost more money and reduced passenger space. The company said the design was fine. Andrews signed off on it. These compromises haunted him. But in early 1912, as the Titanic neared completion, Andrews felt pride overwhelming his doubts. She was magnificent, the largest moving object ever created by human hands, 46,000 tons of steel and ambition. And she was his. April 10, 1912. The Titanic departed Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. Thomas Andrews was aboard, as he always was on maiden voyages, leading a guarantee group of Harland and Wolff workers to observe the ship's performance and fix any problems. He carried a notebook everywhere, jotting down issues: a coat hook loose in a stateroom, a window needing adjustment, the color of a deck chair that didn't match. He was a perfectionist watching his creation perform. Passengers loved him. He gave tours, explained the engineering, beamed with pride. Practically unsinkable, he told them, echoing the marketing materials. The watertight compartments, the double bottom, the advanced design. The Titanic represented the pinnacle of human engineering. What could possibly go wrong? For 4 days, nothing did. The ship performed beautifully. Andrews made his notes, fixed minor issues, and enjoyed watching passengers marvel at his creation. He dined with the captain, Edward Smith, and the ship's owner, J. Bruce Ismay. They discussed the ship's speed. She was making excellent time. Perhaps they could arrive in New York early, make headlines, impress the world. Then came April 14th. Throughout the day, the ship received ice warnings. The North Atlantic was full of icebergs. Captain Smith posted the warnings but maintained speed, 22.5 knots, nearly full speed. Andrews was likely aware of this. Did he object? We don't know. What we know is that at 11:40 p.m., Lookout Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg directly ahead and rang the warning bell 3 times. First Officer Murdoch ordered hard to starboard. The ship turned, but not fast enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side, buckling plates, opening seams, creating multiple punctures below the waterline. Most passengers barely felt it, but Thomas Andrews felt it. He was probably in his stateroom on A deck, and he knew immediately something was terribly wrong. Within minutes, Andrews was summoned to the bridge. Captain Smith needed him to assess the damage. Together with the ship's carpenter, they went below. What Andrews found made his blood run, cold water pouring into the mailroom, flooding the squash court, rising in the forward compartments. He made rapid calculations in his head, the kind of calculations he'd done thousands of times in the design process. But this time, the number spelled doom. 6 compartments breached. The ship could survive 4. But 6. Water would fill the forward compartments, pulling the bow down, causing the ship to tilt forward. As the bow sank, water would spill over the tops of the bulkheads, those bulkheads he designed that didn't reach the ceiling, into the next compartment, then the next. The ship would sink by the head, inevitably, unstoppably. Andrews did the math. He returned to the bridge and gave Captain Smith the worst news a designer could ever deliver. She's going down. I give her an hour. An hour and a half at most, possibly 2. Think about that moment. Thomas Andrews, standing on the bridge of his masterpiece, telling the captain that his design was doomed, that everyone aboard was in mortal danger because of a flaw he'd built into the ship, the bulkheads that didn't go high enough, the lifeboat capacity that was criminally inadequate, the speed they'd maintained despite ice warnings, all of it converging into catastrophe. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered. Andrews knew what that meant. 20 lifeboats for over 2,000 people. Even if they loaded every boat to capacity, which in the chaos would be impossible, hundreds would die, more likely over 1,000. Because of decisions made in drawing rooms and boardrooms, decisions he'd been part of, people were going to drown in the freezing Atlantic. For the next 2 hours, Thomas Andrews moved through the ship in what witnesses described as a daze. But he wasn't paralyzed by shock, he was working. He went cabin to cabin, knocking on doors, urging passengers to put on life jackets and go to the boat deck. Many didn't believe the ship was sinking. It was the Titanic after all. Unsinkable. Andrews told them the truth. Get your lifeboats on and go to the boat deck immediately. He opened stateroom doors that passengers had locked. He threw deck chairs overboard so people in the water would have something to cling to. He gave his own life jacket to a passenger. He worked with frantic energy, trying to save as many as he could, trying to mitigate the disaster his design had created. But he also knew the mathematics. 20 lifeboats. Over 2,000 people. He knew how this would end. Steward John Stewart later testified that he saw Andrews in the first-class corridor around 2000 a.m. The ship was listing noticeably, the bow deep in the water. Stewart asked Andrews if there was any hope. Andrews looked at him and said quietly, "She's gone. In an hour, perhaps less." His face was described as pale and exhausted. His eyes haunted. Another witness, Stewardess Mary Sloan, saw Andrews trying to convince passengers to get into lifeboats. Women were refusing, not believing the danger. Andrews was nearly shouting at them, "The ship is sinking. You must get in the boats." But many still didn't believe him. How could the Titanic sink? It was impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. Andrews had always known it wasn't impossible. And now his worst fears were coming true. As the lifeboats were launched, many of them half empty because passengers refused to believe the danger and officers didn't force them to fill the boats, Andrews watched his inadequate lifeboat count prove fatal. Boat after boat left with empty seats while hundreds of people remained on deck. If he'd fought harder for more lifeboats, if he'd insisted on enough capacity for everyone, these people wouldn't have to die. Around 2010 a.m., Steward Edward Wilton saw Thomas Andrews in the first-class smoking room. This was one of the most beautiful rooms on the ship, wood paneling, stained glass, leather chairs, a massive painting called Plymouth Harbor on the wall. Andrews stood alone, arms crossed, staring at the painting. His life jacket was gone, given away. His jacket was off, discarded. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to save himself. He was just standing there, waiting. Wilton called to him, "Mr. Andrews, aren't you going to try for it?" Andrews didn't respond. He didn't even turn around. He just stood there, staring at the painting as the ship tilted beneath his feet. That was the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Andrews. 10 minutes later, at 20:20 a.m., the Titanic broke apart and sank. We don't know exactly how Thomas Andrews died. Did he stay in that smoking room until the water reached him? Did he walk to the deck and go over the side? Did he wait inside while the ship plunged, choosing to die within his creation rather than in the freezing ocean? We'll never know. His body was never recovered, but we know why he didn't try to save himself. Guilt, the crushing, unbearable weight of responsibility. Thomas Andrews had designed the Titanic. Every choice that led to this disaster traced back to him. The bulkheads that didn't go high enough. The lifeboat capacity that was criminally inadequate. The grand design that prioritized luxury over safety. He'd known the risks, he'd known the compromises, and he'd signed off on them anyway. 1,500 people died that night, and Thomas Andrews believed every single death was his fault. Was he right? That's the question that makes this story so haunting. The truth is complicated. Yes, Andrews designed the ship, but the White Star Line made the final decisions. They chose profit over safety. They refused to add more lifeboats. They pressured for speed over caution. The Board of Trade had outdated regulations. Captain Smith ignored ice warnings. Multiple failures converged to create the disaster. But Andrews was there at the beginning. He'd drawn the plans. He'd made the calculations. He'd known the vulnerabilities. And when the company pushed back on safety features, he'd given in. He'd compromised. He'd chosen keeping his job and building his masterpiece over fighting harder for the changes that might have saved lives. After the disaster, when his wife Helen received the news that Thomas was lost, she was pregnant with their second child. Their daughter Elizabeth was only 2 years old. She would grow up barely remembering her father. The son Helen was carrying would be born never knowing him. Helen lived the rest of her life as a widow, and she never remarried. She kept Thomas's letters, his designs, his memory. And she told everyone who asked, he died with his ship, as he should have. That's the terrible question. Should Thomas Andrews have died? Or should he have fought to survive, to live with the guilt, to spend the rest of his life working to make ships safer so this could never happen again? By choosing to die, Andrews avoided facing the consequences of his design. He avoided the inquiries, the accusations, the public blame. He avoided having to look at grieving widows and orphans and explain why he hadn't fought harder for more lifeboats. He took the guilt to the bottom of the Atlantic with him. But maybe that's too harsh. Maybe standing in that smoking room, watching his masterpiece die, Thomas Andrews was simply broken. Maybe the weight of 1,500 deaths was too much for any human being to carry. Maybe he chose to die not out of cowardice, but out of a sense of responsibility. A captain goes down with his ship, and in a very real sense, Andrews was the Titanic's true captain. He'd brought it into existence. Perhaps it was right that he exit existence with it. The Titanic disaster changed shipbuilding forever. New regulations required lifeboat capacity for everyone aboard. Watertight bulkheads were required to extend higher. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic. Radio protocols were improved. The changes came too late for the 1,500 who died, but they saved countless lives in the decades since. Thomas Andrews didn't live to see those changes. He died at 39, his brilliant career cut short by the disaster his own creation became. In Belfast, where the Titanic was built, there's a memorial to him. But his real memorial is the changed regulations, the safer ships, the lives saved by the lessons learned from his fatal mistakes. The image of Thomas Andrews standing in that smoking room, alone, staring at a painting as the water rises, it haunts me, because it represents something profound about human ambition and human failure. We build great things. We push boundaries, create marvels, achieve the impossible. But every creation carries risk. Every design has flaws. Every achievement casts a shadow. Thomas Andrews built the Titanic to be a monument to human achievement. Instead, it became a monument to human hubris. And he, the architect of that hubris, couldn't live with what he'd created. So he stood in his beautiful smoking room, surrounded by the luxury he designed, and waited for his creation to kill him along with everyone else. That's the tragedy of Thomas Andrews. Not that he died, but that he died believing he'd failed completely, unable to see that his brilliance would ultimately save lives even as his compromises cost them. The Titanic disaster made ships safer. Thomas Andrews' mistakes taught the world lessons that prevented future disasters. But he never knew that. He died thinking he'd built a death trap. And maybe in his mind, that's exactly what he deserved, to die in the trap he'd created, one victim among 1,500, the designer drowning in his own fatal design.